And now we're excited to hear from Representative Scanlon. Representative? And you're on mute. Okay, good.
Yeah, sorry, had to work it out there. Well, thank you to the Patriotic Millionaires and everyone on this call for bringing your roadshow to our district. You've expertly explained how income inequality is one of the most pressing issues facing our country now. And it's one that really hits home in Pennsylvania's 5th Congressional District, which is what I call home. The district runs from row houses in Philly, South Philadelphia, out to mainline estates. And it covers a lot of blue collar and really former middle class homes in between. It has some areas of blight, and it includes the Port of Philadelphia, the airport, the former Navy Yard, the shipyard, some refineries, and a lot of post-industrial properties. So pre-COVID, our working families, like the work hard family that you highlighted, were underwater. We had a study come out in October of last year, so just a year ago, pre-COVID, which found that families at the median income at the end of every month were underwater once they paid housing, healthcare, and childcare costs. So that was pre-COVID. And of course, it's only worse now. We have a lot of essential workers, a lot of frontline workers in our district. You spoke a little bit about this K-shaped recovery. You know, folks at the top are kind of riding easily through this, and folks who were struggling beforehand are struggling even more now. So you know, it all comes back to economic inequality, stagnant wages, rising costs, and making sure that those who aren't doing well or were just getting by, that they don't have to face the brunt of what is going to be a very real recession. And as you've been pointing out, that's perpetuated by a tax system that gives too many breaks and benefits to corporations and wealthy individuals. I'm just finishing up my first full term in Congress, and one of the reasons I ran was the 2017 tax boondoggle that you talked about. Pennsylvania has a greater share of student loan debt than almost any other state. I think we're 3rd out of 50. More people have student loan debt, and they have more student loan debt than other states. So when we saw that tax break for the millionaires and the corporations had created a $1.7 trillion debt, well, that's how much student loan debt we have. If we're going to give away money, shouldn't we be doing it to help people pay for their educations? So, because that's what it was a giveaway of money. So, you know, with all these problems, obviously, your suggestions about reforming the tax code so we don't exacerbate this problem and we restore progressivity, that's obviously got to be a huge part. Right now, you know, we're staring down trying to respond to the coronavirus pandemic, and we've been pushing to get another stimulus bill to help folks who are most at risk. But we also know that we need to do things which have relationship to the tax code, like expanding the earned income tax credit, expanding and making refundable the child tax credit so that we can give a boost to the folks who are most at risk. You know, we talk about the progressivity in the tax code. It is unconscionable that the 400 richest Americans pay a lower effective tax rate than anyone else. And of course, we need look no further than the White House, where the president and his family more closely resemble the other family that you highlighted, with recent reporting indicating that the president, an alleged billionaire, paid $750 or nothing for multiple years in a row over the last decade. I paid more than that when I was a lifeguard at a state park 30 years ago, just for the summer. And I bet almost everyone in our audience pays a great deal more than that now. So we also need to bolster the IRS because it has been starved. It is unable to do its function right now. It's unable to make sure that people pay the tax that they owe. And it's unable to provide assistance to people who need it to straighten out their own tax bills. So I would love to hear more about the policies you're discussing, you know, online. Love to hear more about your ideas. And thank you for coming and helping us learn more.
Yeah, great. Let's dive into some of we have some fabulous questions in the chat.
Great.
Let's start. You mentioned this briefly, but let's just dive into it a little bit more. Don't we need to worry about enforcement too? It feels like rich people can just decide not to pay their taxes and nothing bad will happen to them. I read somewhere that the wealthiest Americans are going to skip out on about $5 trillion worth of taxes over the next 10 years because the IRS is not appropriately staffed to deal, and they don't have the high level auditors. That seems like a really easy first fix for you folks. So how are your colleagues beginning to talk about that? Where does that particular issue stand?
I haven't heard the specific discussion, but it's certainly something that I've heard in talking with folks like yourselves and policy wonks about what we can do to start getting a handle on this. And even if we accept the White House narrative, supposedly the president's been under audit for 6 or 8 years. And, if they can't finish up that one audit, maybe they do need more help.
Well said.
Sorry.
That's great. That's an excellent way to think of it. Okay, I'll kick this one to Chuck, who is our resident expert in this. So Chuck, you inherited wealth, and we've got an estate tax that has been renamed the death tax. So we've got a question here about can you explain a little bit more about how we could reform the estate tax and the inheritance tax? How should we do this?
Yeah, well, I should say, the estate tax has been sort of under assault for 20 years, and it's been weakened and decimated. And as we said, the exemption now is 11 million for an individual, 22 million for a couple, and a whole kind of wealth defense industry has grown up. Lawyers and wealth managers help people avoid the estate tax, and so it's become porous. And really now, so we could fix the existing estate tax. We could try to close some of those loopholes, make it more efficient. There's a pretty good argument to be made for shifting from an estate tax on the estates, the heirs, to a inheritance tax on the heirs, the recipients. Because right now, if my aunt gives me, $5 million, I'm not going to pay any taxes on that. If I win the lottery and get $5 million, I have to pay taxes. If I find a bag of money on the side of the street, I'm supposed to report it and pay the taxes. If I earn it or, I have to pay it. But if I inherit it, I don't. And so we could essentially say the inheritance tax should be another form of income tax, just like capital gains and wage tax, just tax it above a certain threshold. I think that would help us make the defensible case that this is not about taxing businesses and successful individuals. We're taxing the heirs, people like me who just were, picked the right parents, if you will. So I think that's the one way to go. But either way, we need to have a very strong transfer tax at death to sort of slow that dynastic wealth and accretion.
You're not afraid that rich heiresses will lose their incentive to have rich parents?
Yeah, no, it's one of the risks. There's always a downside, Teddy.
And maybe I'll kick this one to Kristen, because Kristen, you've been on both sides of the tracks, I guess. How to say it? I mean, you have a real lived world experience in a real desperate situation, and now you're dealing with a bunch of greedy bastards every day. How can you convince them to jump in and get the country back on track? Is that even possible?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is just education about the disparity in the tax code. I mean, I think a lot of folks don't understand how the tax rates work. I think a lot of people, when they hear any kind of increase in taxes, they immediately have a bad reaction to it, not realizing how it benefits them in some fundamental way. And I think it's time for the wealthiest people to pay their fair share, myself included. But I do think a lot of it's just education.
Great. Representative Scanlon, what do you think about a wealth tax?
Well, it certainly seems like that's where we're headed. I mean, there's so few great tools to deal with this extreme wealth disparity that we're starting to see. I guess it's always been a factor in our economy, but we're now at rates, as I understand it, back like the days of the robber barons and the late 1800s or whatever, where you think of, people literally dying of poverty in the streets, and then people having the Gilded Age and just more money than they knew what to do with.
I would just add on, I think, 100 years ago, we had the first inheritance taxes and income taxes, not simply to raise revenue, but to put a brake on that concentration of wealth and power that is corrupting and distorting democracy. So it's not just about revenue, it's about protecting, our republic from the distortions of concentrations of wealth and power. The billionaires have just so much power.
Well, and before that, the middle class is what has really defined America over time. And we're really losing that solid middle class. As I said, in my region, folks who were middle class, this is the first generation that's not going to be able to leave, their children better off than they were, because of the erosion of union rights and also this escalating inequality in income.
The way I usually put it is that your constituents, even the well-to-do ones on the other side of City Line Avenue, they're already paying a wealth tax because most of their wealth is in those houses. And it's just time to have the rich people pay a wealth tax too, the way middle class people have been doing for their whole lives.
So Congresswoman, you mentioned that you've seen inequality at work in your own district. How can you go about trying to convince the rich people in your district that reducing inequality is in their best interest too?
Well, I think we have a fair amount of progressive voters in the district. It's also a very strong Quaker culture here. So that also lends to at least receptivity to thoughts about how we need to level the playing field. But I think people are also really starting to see the harmful societal effects of having too much have and too much have not, and nothing in the middle.
So here's one for Morris. In the presentation, Mr. Pearl said that some 90 companies paid zero in taxes whatsoever legally. How in the world do we fix this corporate tax code? This thing is a mess.
Well, I think we have to come up with some system so that companies that have revenue from the United States attribute a proportional part of their income to the United States. And the current plan, the Republicans' basic philosophy is that these companies with intellectual property can transfer their intellectual property so easily to another country that we have to have an appeasement policy and appease them by lowering their taxes to give them some incentive to, I don't know what to do. So I think we have to end that. We have to say that if you sell stuff in the United States to Americans, that you have to pay taxes on a proportional part of your income here in the United States to the country that provides the services that your customers use to buy your computers and your coffee and all the other things that you make money on.
So here's another one. How can we get other politicians to listen to regular Americans as much as they do to their millionaire friends? Congresswoman?
Contact them. I mean, write letters, make phone calls, ask for meetings, show up, register people to vote if they're not listening.
No, and I would also add that I think, you display an opinion by how you vote. And so, if you're looking for at politicians and you're looking at who to vote for, like I purposely seek out people that are working on income inequality and taxation. And, those are important issues to me. And I think if politicians know how important those issues are to regular taxpayers, they're going to make it a priority.
We could also have some campaign finance reform like we do here in New York City for our local races to reduce the incentive for politicians to sort of hang out and chill with rich people all the time.
Sure. And we've seen such an escalation of that in the wake of the Citizens United decision. And that was a huge reason why HR 1, this past Congress or almost past Congress, was HR 1 to really try to start tackling what we can do to reduce the influence of dark money in our politics and make it more transparent and hopefully just reduce it altogether. The idea of moving to some kind of federally funded campaign finance. My colleague John Sarbanes has invested a lot of time and effort in trying to make that a workable system. And I would love to see that move forward.
Yeah, we are big supporters. HR 1, for anybody on the call who doesn't know, was the very first bill that the new House of Representatives passed this Congress, and it was a suite of reform pieces that really would put more power in the hands of the people. And that's one point to emphasize also, Congresswoman, as Chuck said earlier, you know, in a democratic society, when wealth can be so easily translated into power, it's entirely appropriate to reduce the power of people, you know, through the tax code. So, so Morris, what can I tell my friend who thinks a flat tax is a good idea?
Well, you can tell your friend that if we had a flat tax, everyone paying the same percentage, that would be unworkable. It would be raising the taxes on poor people who pay the least now, and they honestly don't have any more money to pay any more taxes. It would be reducing the tax on rich people like me, and that would just make inequality worse. Because if I have lower taxes, a year later, I have even more money and I'm even richer, and I have even more income because my income compounds because I'm saving more of it. So that would make the rich richer and richer and richer, and the poor people would be falling further and further and further behind. I guess if that's what you want, then that's okay.
Flat tax kind of is right up there with flat earth. No, just don't.
All right, let's see. Do you have, so this is from Lindsay. Do you have any comparison data or some easy infographics that show that if the top 1% paid even a few percentage points more, what funding would be available to address real needs like funding for education, fixing roads, et cetera? I think it's hard for people to understand what that money would actually do to solve problems that impact their lives, especially those in the middle class who think they're more like millionaires because that's what they aspire to. And I'm going to just push this one to Morris because this is a really important thing for people to understand, the distinction between state taxes and federal taxes. Morris, can you try to climb into that a little bit?
Yeah, I think though the things that Ms. Albright mentioned, like fixing roads and education, those are things that are mostly done at the state level, which is fine. I mean, we have our United States, it means the united of the 50 states. And so yes, for states, they have checking accounts like regular people do. And if they want to spend more money at education, fixing roads, they have to have more revenue. And you can look at how much revenue they have and how much more they need to actually provide education for their children. And that's the main thing that states do, is education. And after that is healthcare. The federal government is entirely different. The federal government does not take in and send out the same amount of money each year. The federal government creates these things we call dollars. And so the number of dollars in existence actually goes up every year, which is good because the economy is expanding every year and it's supposed to. So the federal government and the state government are entirely different things because the federal government's the only entity that actually creates dollars. And so, yes, I think that probably should be something that we should have, is some infographics or something about that. But we don't at this exact moment, but maybe we will next time.
And let's see, I'll kick this one to Kristen. Kristen, I saw somewhere that America is now even more unequal than France right before the French Revolution, which did not turn out really well for the wealthy people. I mean, like really people, come on.
Pitchforks are coming.
Right. And it's not going to be pitchforks. Isn't it in the interest of the wealthy to level the playing field a little bit, Kristen?
Absolutely it is. And I think, I think this gets back to the greed factor, that we've talked about before, which, if you're running a business or, you've got lots of money, of course, you want to do everything that you can to hold on to it. But I think if you look at the bigger picture, what's in the interest of a, more equitable society and, how we're all going to live peacefully together, paying your fair share, particularly to fund programs and services that are important to you, that's really paramount. Yeah, I think right now we're heading down a really, really bad path. And I know one of the other questions that had popped up was about how COVID's been impacting, income equality. And it's particularly impactful for women who are having to leave the workforce in droves. So, to take care of children or to deal with sick parents or, it's disproportionately affecting women. And so, I think that there's a lot that we need to, consider with regards to, the taxation rate and how we do make things more equitable.
And I was just going to pick up on that with respect to COVID. We saw in the early rounds of COVID relief, just this very modest sum of stimulus, the $1,200, and, modest amounts of unemployment insurance kept the whole economy afloat and moving forward.
Yeah.
And that was money that Congress directly tried to feed to the lowest income people so that they could stay in their homes, so that they could pay their essential bills. And look, the stock market stayed, way up there. So that was because lowest income people got the support they needed in time. And, we have the head of the Fed telling us we need more of that, which is what's been so frustrating that we can't get this next bill through.
And Representative Scanlon, you'll see my 5-year-old here who is being
Yes.
homeschooled because she cannot go to her public school that she's enrolled in. This is insanity. Y'all have to deal with this. What is going on? How are we going to get this dealt with?
Well,
It's a matter of money.
Yeah.
We open these schools if the federal government would give the school systems the money they need to open.
the school systems, and finally wrestling with the fact that we're never going to have a really robust economy until we deal with childcare and having quality childcare available. I mean, the way it's been running is just, totally on the margins and not enough government support, but we have to solve that both to dig out of COVID and to drive our economy to the next level.
So Chuck, I'll kick this one to you. Won't increasing taxes make rich people give less money to charity? They don't
Maybe.
give that much in the first place, y'all.
Yeah.
They do. It's like they give less as a percentage than everybody else
Yeah.
does. So the generous tax folks, I mean, come on. But anyway, Chuck, go ahead.
Well, I think that the more important point here is philanthropy does some things well. It, builds buildings at college campuses and builds hospitals, but it is not a substitute for what we're talking about here, a fair tax system that raises revenue from wealthy people and makes investments public investments, not private charitable choices in the communities we need. And I remember I actually worked with Bill Gates's dad on defending the estate tax, but he used to sort of in an offhanded way say, isn't it a problem that my son is going to take $100 billion that he's made at Microsoft and put it into his private foundation, and he will make all the decisions about the allocation of that money, and he'll never pay any taxes on that. So I think we need to look at how to reform the charity sector to encourage philanthropy from everybody in society, but realize that it's a form of private power and it's not a substitute, and it's not going to make the investments in the sewage treatment plants and the infrastructure and anti-poverty programs. As much as charities have tried to step up during COVID, giving people an extra $600 in their unemployment check had a way bigger impact than anything in the private charity sector ever did.
That's so right. All right, so Bonnie says your segment of training on the tax code should be a documentary expose that is televised. Thank you, Bonnie. And it should be televised on 60 Minutes and PBS and others. I'll bet Jimmy Kimmel would do it. And then she says, and sorry, I guess I missed this, but is this a bill that has to be introduced or is it even drafted? And I mean, Congresswoman, you can answer that, but what we tried to do with this presentation, Bonnie, is give a sense of like what the whole rewrite of the federal tax code looks like. So this is just the basics of here. It's structured from top to bottom. You can get it like kind of what is the premise of the tax code. That's where we wanted to start this. But there are a variety. Y'all would either do it in one big bill or in a bunch of tiny pieces. Do you want to talk people through the process of writing tax policy?
Oh,
Everybody can go to sleep.
This is where the Oscar Mayer sausage making comes in handy to understand.
Yeah. Well, I think, there've been over 7,000 bills introduced since I got to Congress. I didn't introduce them all, but there've been over 7,000 bills introduced since January of 2018. There are pieces of everything we've talked about here, I think, in some bill or another, but there would have to be an omnibus package that kind of looped it all together and looked at the unintended consequences versus the intended consequences, because there's always, I took tax law, 35 years ago in law school, but there's always an unintended consequence with the tax code change. But I think overall simplification with an emphasis on the basic principles that you've laid out here today is how we have to go. It's just gotten too complicated and way too skewed to benefiting the people who have the lobbyists in the room and are prepared to carve out those little exceptions that have completely overtaken the whole code.
That's right. And one thing interesting, Bonnie, they have to reintroduce bills every new Congress.
Mhm.
They don't just ride over. That's something that I learned kind of later in my political life. So people are testing out legislation with their colleagues, and then they'll get a little more support, make some tweaks to it, reintroduce it in the next Congress in a different form. So this would need to be a new introduction of all of these concepts through legislation, either a big piece of legislation or a small one. I think that we've covered most of the questions. I want to just do one more and then we'll wrap right at 1. So Congresswoman, I've listened to a few of these calls and have heard many of your colleagues talk about how useful this presentation is, and a lot of them seem shocked at how easily we explain it. How do you all within the Congress talk about the importance of fair taxation to your constituents? And do you all share ideas and tips on explaining these concepts to people in your districts?
There's some sharing. It's been mostly informal, I think. I come from a line of family lawyers, small town lawyers. And so my grandfather and father drilled into me early on that you need to use plain English as opposed to $20 words. So this is a very attractive presentation as far as I'm concerned. One of the committees I served on for the last 2 years has been the Select Committee to Modernize Congress, which I think of as the committee to drag Congress into the 20th century, at least. But one of the things we've been talking about there is having more professional development for members of Congress, where there's the opportunity to share, best practices and presentations to the public, that kind of thing. So there's definitely a lot of sharing at the staff level. And of course, staff does so much of the work in Congress. But we're trying to work on getting more sharing, especially around issues like this, which should be bipartisan issues, having more sharing across the aisle as well.
Fabulous. And we've got just a couple minutes left, so I think we'll wrap up. I'd love to just hear from each of the millionaires a couple of closing thoughts, and then we'll turn it to you, Representative Scanlon, to close us up. And before we close, I do want to mention to go to taxtherich.com. We'd love any feedback on the presentation. If you'd like to host one of these for a group of friends or colleagues, we'd be happy to do one for you. And you can join our fight to fix this on taxtherich.com too. So let's close it up. Morris, closing thoughts?
Well, thank you, Representative Scanlon. I hope that you and your colleagues can improve the situation before our country ends up like France was 200 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Also, it's very heartening to meet you and to think about your leadership and being a representative in Congress. And I hope your voice gets out there. And I do think in some ways the problem is we have this 2-tier tax code. We have the tax code that pretty much everybody else has to live with. And then we have this wealthy person's tax code with all these gimmicks. And when I say wealthy, I'm really talking about the top 1/10 of 1%. And there's a huge amount of revenue there, and there's a huge amount of fixing to do there. But I think there's the will to do it. I think people get that. And I think if we keep beating this drum, people will, the public is with us. And so thank you for your leadership.
Kristen, closing thoughts?
Yeah, I would just say, if you're listening in to this today and you're shocked or horrified or learned something new and you want to make a change, the best way to do that is by how you vote. We're all voting right now, and paying attention to what's happening in the political sphere, and supporting folks like Representative Scanlon, who are also have a passion for this topic, is super, super important.
And Representative Scanlon, any closing thoughts?
Just so appreciative of your bringing this to my district so people can dig into it a little bit. And for folks in the district, I would just say this is how we make change. I mean, we've seen in Pennsylvania, the Fair Districts PA movement, which just took off to try to reduce the impact of gerrymandering. And that became very much a people-driven project, just bringing in support from all across the Commonwealth. So we need more of that. But here's another area where we really need people to organize and get behind these ideas in order to offset the influence of lobbyists and big money, which is still a very real factor.
That's right. All right, y'all. Thanks so much. Taxtherich.com. Again, Representative Scanlon, thank you so much for being here. We so appreciate it. And thank you to everyone for listening. Taxtherich.com. Thanks so much.
Thank you.